Hello and welcome to another video episode of your favorite daily public policy podcast, All Things Policy from the Takshashila Institution. I'm Anushka Saxena, a staff research analyst with the institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program, and today on this episode I'm joined by my colleague Amit Kumar from the program. Amit works on India-China trade and Chinese economic and technological ecosystems, and most recently he has authored an expansive paper on approaching the de-risking question in India-China trade relations in the hope of informing policy on the subject. Happy to have you on this episode, Amit.
Thank you so much, Anushka. Happy to be here.
Now, before we begin dissecting what Amit has had to tell us through his paper, a little context for our listeners. China is India's largest trade partner and at the same time its biggest threat in the neighborhood, both militaristically and even economically and technologically. As much as importing from China has helped India's economic growth in several ways, it has also led to the creation of a burgeoning trade imbalance between the two neighbors favoring China. And this dilemma has, not just in India, but in other countries too across the world, led to governments approaching the trade question, especially vis-a-vis China, not from a lens of comparative advantage and economic cooperation, but from a security-first perspective. And it is understandable why in India this security first lens vis-a-vis China has so much appeal. Why de-risking seems like such a palatable option despite India's overwhelming dependence on China, right? And there is a combination of factors playing out today that explain this. One, of course, is the actual threat of China creating military disruptions in not just our continental but also maritime theaters. The second is the perceived economic and technological threat based both on India's dependence on China as well as China's exploitation of such dependence in other regions across the world. And the third is that policy discourse domestically in India today focuses heavily on self-reliance, and the emphasized agenda items, the actionable agenda items like PLI schemes have made it increasingly possible for India to consider de-risking from China as an option. And last year itself, Amit, you were on All Things Policy, and that time we were discussing another paper of yours on a strategic and critical vulnerability framework to understanding trade relations broadly in the world, right? And now it seems like in your latest paper, you've applied that framework to the India-China trade basket, and you've distilled certain areas where vulnerabilities may or may not exist. So just to kick off the conversation with you here on this note, Amit, can you first start by telling our listeners what was the need to write this paper when we know that there is so much discourse on de-risking today and there is equally a lot of literature available discussing the challenge at hand? What does your paper bring to the table in that context?
Right, Anushka. So this was a long-term project that we had at Takshashila. And the idea was to contribute to the debate and the question. As you mentioned that the debate surrounding decoupling and de-risking had become very intensive in the last couple of years. And of course, India has had its own challenges vis-a-vis China. And therefore, this question had also come to the fore before the strategic analysts, the experts, trade experts, etc. As to how do we de-risk? Is there a need to de-risk? And I think there's a proper agreement over this question that yes, there is a need to de-risk your economy vis-a-vis China when it comes to your trade relationships. And of course, India imports a lot from China, right? And that there's a sense, and rightly so, that that renders you strategically vulnerable in some areas, which China has shown its willingness and the ability to coerce its trade partners, not so far vis-a-vis India, but you have seen examples where China has tried to coerce its trade partners
Yeah.
to extract some strategic gains or some strategic bargain, right? So there was this acknowledgement that so that we are not vulnerable to China, we need to de-risk our trade relationship and economy vis-a-vis China, and therefore the need for the paper. Now, specifically, why to your question, if there are already two in literature on de-risking, I would like to argue that there are not many literature. I would argue there is no literature that in fact talks about or gives you a framework or tells you what are those areas where we need to de-risk, right?
Interesting.
Not
Yeah.
the entire trade basket can be. I mean, if that was going to be the case, you have to completely halt your trade partnership with China. But what are those specific areas that you need to de-risk vis-a-vis China, and therefore there lies the utility of this paper.
Interesting. So, I guess then the next question in the natural progression of our conversation is: have you figured out what those areas are? Does your paper then answer this question? What should we de-risk? And I do agree to you with a great extent. Most of the literature is silent on this question, or very vaguely affirmative of this question of the areas that we must de-risk. And you've also, as you very rightly pointed out in your work, the import basket is diverse, the numbers are huge. So yes, there is indeed a need to maybe go down to this first decimal point and start, instead of kind of restating the problem, really looking at a solutions oriented approach now that we have this given consensus that we have to de-risk. So then to my question, what is your answer? How should we know what to de-risk?
See, in my first paper, which you mentioned in the introduction, we had a series of parameters that we need to take into account when we decide those items or trade where de-risking is necessary, because they might constitute strategic or critical vulnerabilities and might give China that option of extracting some bargain out of it. So a few criteria that were mentioned in that paper were: first, it has to be, when you're trading, when you're looking at strategic and critical vulnerabilities, the trading relationship has to be vis-a-vis an adversary, right? And this case, the entire basket of India-China trade or import basket qualifies that test, because China is an adversary in that sense,
right.
And therefore the entire basket becomes very appropriate for this kind of scrutiny, right?
Right.
So that checks off, right?
Yeah.
The second thing is, are those I would say, are those areas that wherein you trade, are they substitutable? Are they alternative sources of supply, or alternative products that can fill in the gap in case of a disruption? And how substitutable are they, right? There's a second factors. Third and fourth takes into account whether how big of an impact would a disruption create on your populace or the general population, or the allied sectors, or the cascading effect that it will trigger in your industry and other allied industries, right? So these are factors that you have to take into account when you decide whether a particular whether trade in a particular item constitutes a strategic or critical vulnerability for India. And to measure these things, what I have done is I have created two metrics, one called the relative impact factor, and the second one being product complexity index.
Okay.
Now the relative impact factor takes into account the scale of immediate shock that India will have to absorb if any sort of halt, or the supply gets disrupted or halted, or China decides to impose any sort of economic sanctions or economic trade restrictions. So what would be the scale of that particular immediate shock, right? And that is what RIF does, the relative impact factor. It serves as a metric to measure the immediate shock that Indian economy will have to face,
Yeah.
right? The second factor, the product complexity index. Now, it is a very interesting index, in my opinion. What it does is it takes every product of that is under trade, international trade, and assigns a value based on the level of technological complexity that goes into making that product, and how diffused is that particular technology among existing countries that trade in that art. So a higher value will tell you that not only that product is highly complex technological in terms of technological complexity, but also the complexity required to produce or manufacture that particular product is held by only few countries. And lower the value, it will tell you that there are a lot of countries which have the required capability to produce that particular commodity. They might not necessarily be doing that because of competitive or comparative advantages, but they do have the required complexity. And this tells you how substitutable the particular product
Yeah.
would be. If there is high product complexity in a product ranks higher on PCI, it will tell you that it is less substitutable. So the idea using these two metrics is to filter out those items that will have a very that will have significant immediate shock and long term where disruption, the period of disruption would be long term, right?
Right.
So this is the idea, and this is how we filter. So we eliminate all those items where immediate shock would be less, and substitutability or the period of disruption would be less.
Right. So that's really interesting, right? Because gameplay of relative impact factor and product complexity index can really tell you, can really narrow it down from a diverse import basket to a list of products that perhaps India should focus the most on, because they might not be most easily substitutable in the short to medium time frame, and at the same time may cause the most significant of disruptions in vis-a-vis both the consumer base and industrial output, right?
Yeah.
So that again, I think those values then really assign, they really kind of make it meaningful for you to have tests like the cascading effect and the substitutability effect in the strategic and critical vulnerability framework. So I looked at your application of these indices to the import basket, and I believe in your paper you conclude that there are three broad product categories that really need immediate attention, right? One of them is organic chemicals, the other is machinery and machining tools, and the third is electronics and electrical components, right? So how did you come to this conclusion? Why is it that these three matter in the broader scheme of things?
See, when you started with this research, there were a whole lot of products and categories that were to be examined, and the idea was to look at those particular product categories that required the most immediate attention by state, right? So, and of course, you could not just scrutinize all the elements or all the items that are under that are being traded between India and China. So if you go to in terms of trade, how the products are classified, the accepted uniform classification nomenclature is HS codes, and which particularly clubs products of similar categories into one, and then you have finer classifications going down the road. So HS2 is the broadest classification, HS4, HS6, HS8.
Right.
So so HS2, you have 99 categories where trade happens, and there you have then further classifications within these HS2 items. And in HS2 items, when I applied the dependence 30, so the idea was to look at those areas where dependence on China is greater than 30%, because the assumption was if dependence is less than 30 on China, there exists substantial diversification, and there are alternatives which you can go to in case of disruption. And also because China is home to about 30% of the global manufacturing output and by value both, right? So it it is given that at least 30% of your, I mean, give or take, average 30% of your uh, imports might come from China. So
right.
the idea was to study all those items where the standard deviation was upwards from this threshold of 30%, right? And when I applied this filter, there were a lot of, there were around 24 items that came in. But the three strategic items that applying the subjectivity filter and seeing what would be the three most strategic uh, products, I zeroed in on organic chemicals, which also, by the way, contain APIs. That is a matter of intense discussion in the discourse. Machineries, critical machineries, as you would know, and machine, etc., and electronic equipments.
Yeah.
And to my surprise, and as the luck would have it, these three categories together account for more than 65% of India's total imports from China.
Yeah.
So that kind of allows me to like only study these three categories and yet cover around 2/3 of India's imports from China. Now, not to say that other areas are not something which do not require scrutiny, but I think what this choosing these three items allows me to focus my study on these three things, and they are also the most strategically
Vital.
vital, and also the fact that you cover almost 2/3 of India's import basket. So that was the reasoning behind choosing these three categories.
Right. That's really fascinating and makes a lot of sense, right? You took a threshold and then you came to the conclusion using both subjective knowledge and the value some of these domains have as directly visible on economic growth. You came to the conclusion that these three areas must be looked at, and as you rightly said, they do constitute about 65-66% of India's trade with China. So that also covers a larger base when it comes to a very broad import basket. If we can quickly delve into, I think, each of these three areas that you've identified, I think it would be very useful for our listeners to know where exactly in these areas can we perhaps then go to the third decimal point and focus our attention to. Let's start with organic chemicals, right? We know for a fact that organic chemicals have a range of applications, and a bunch of them coming in from China can be used across industrial outputs, including in agriculture, leather, textiles, food, and of course, most importantly, pharmaceuticals and APIs, right? And these perhaps are vital intermediate goods where India also has a value addition kind of a prerogative, right? Because it has both wide-ranging domestic and international export markets. So, can you tell us about what your findings were when you applied maybe RIF and PCI to this particular category, and have some areas come out for you that the government should have focused attention towards?
Yeah. Of course, and just to add to what you said, organic chemicals is also important because they have huge cascading effect, because they have applications not just within those industries where you are importing these things, but they have applications across leather industry, textile industry, agriculture, pesticides, API you mentioned, and the whole chemical industries, polymers, etc. So if disruption happens in this particular space, you will see a disruption, and it will trigger a cascading effect into other industries as well. So this is an important choke point, and therefore it becomes very important and significant to study import dependence and the extent of strategic and critical vulnerability in this area. Now, when it comes to your question, the three highlights that I would like to bring out here would be that one, antibiotics, penicillins and other antibiotics at HS6 classification emerged as those products which had the highest potential for immediate shock. In case tomorrow China puts a halt on those supplies, there will be a huge impact and immediate shock that India will have to trigger. But the interesting point here, and they are also critical because given the fact that India is the pharmacy of the world, and the income levels in India and how critical these medicines are to your healthcare industry and the people, right? It brings down your healthcare costs, the cost for medicine, right?
Right.
So it is critical in a lot of ways. It is critical to your economy, right? But while these antibiotics and APIs and penicillins have in particular penicillin and antibiotics, while they have very high potential for immediate shock, the interesting thing about them is in terms of product complexity, they rank very low. The product complexity index or the technological complexity required to produce or manufacture them, especially I'm talking about here, talking about penicillins and other antibiotics here, is quite low. So that tells you that any disruption, even though it will be immediate shock and high immediate shock, exponential shock, it will be short-lived because the complexity required to produce them is very less. So this was one thing, one highlight of the study in this. Second, heterocyclic compounds. So heterocyclic compounds are another form of APIs that you come across, and they also again have most of the applications are in the medicine sector or the healthcare sector, but other applications also included. And this is something, this particular product category, heterocyclic compounds, is something which exhibited very high potential for immediate shock.
Right.
And also moderate to high product complexity.
Right.
And therefore the relative ease of substitutability in this particular segment was something which was high, right?
Yeah.
Substitutability was would take you medium to long term, right?
Yeah.
So this is another, so this becomes an area for the government to intervene in some form. What could those measures be is a question for different for different podcasts. But that is another area that requires attention. And my last point, the last highlight I would say, is not all APIs. We listen to the arguments and the debate in the public discourse that all APIs should be in India should be producing all the APIs. Not all APIs are worthy of state attention, in my opinion, because not only do they have very low impact, low potential for immediate shock, they are also very less complex in terms of product. So in case a disruption comes to our doors, we'll be easily able to substitute those and replace those supplies.
Right. So, as you rightly said, yes, there is this proactive discourse of India's over dependence on APIs, and yet, you make the very interesting case in your paper that yeah, perhaps in the short to medium term, if we were to be faced with economic coercion vis-a-vis APIs from China, yeah, India could figure something out, and the infrastructure may not be in place, but perhaps if we start thinking now, we could find alternative substitute partners that can substitute our imports in this very important healthcare component for us. Let's go to the second sector that you identified, right? Machinery and machining tools. Again, there's a massive debate on this. Analysts and scholars have been arguing very proactively that some of our drilling equipment, important machines, even things like cranes, a bunch of them come from China.
Right.
And do you then think that these would rank low on the complexity index? Can we go out and find other alternatives, or are they not that disruptive in case of a economic challenge faced from China that perhaps we do not need to de-risk in this area?
Yeah. So the thing about machinery and mechanical appliances is that they are not just normal import goods or final products. They are final products, but they are capital goods. And capital goods, if they have a special purpose in the economy of a country. That is, they create value. They are capital goods. They create value. They create other products. They're used in other products. So again, the cascade. Right. So you import these machines to create and manufacture other equipment, which are again then sold to the consumer, the final consumers, right?
Yeah.
So these are kind of products that are largely employed by large firms or small firms. to manufacture finished items for consumers. So, and therefore, the scale of cascading effect again in this sense would be very high if there is a disruption in the supply of these items, right, machine tools. And do not forget that these also include your critical machine tools, which are, and most of these are dual use items, which also go into civilian applications, but also have military applications, military grade applications in defense sector, space sector, telecommunications, etc., right? So, so therefore, a scrutiny of this particular product segment also becomes important. Now, what I've in my research, what came out was, I mean, again, I'll restrict myself, be brief and restrict myself to three important key highlights. Was that portable automatic data processing machines, less than 10 kg, that would be your laptops and the tabs, etc., that you use. So all sorts of data processing machines, which the laptop that we're sitting at are all data processing machines. These and other heavier data processing machines exhibit a very high import dependence on China, and because of that, the impact they exhibit very high potential for immediate shock again in case the supplies halt. So, and that will, and processing machines in fact scored highest on the RIF scale within this category and across the category, and it was huge on the scale, right? Almost 80-90%, and India, this is one category where India imports the most from China. So the potential for immediate shock in this particular process, when it comes to processing machines, is immense, right? Is exponentially high. But again, what is interesting is the product complexity of these data processing machines is kind of low to moderate. And in the sense, and the sense, this is also, and this is, you can see that there are multiple countries in Southeast Asia that engage in manufacturing and assembling of these things, and therefore if you look at the larger picture, you'll realize that complexity need not be much for these areas, because the technological diffusion is high in that sense. And therefore, and most of the companies, where, although India might be importing from China, most of the companies that are operating in this segment are largely foreign companies that manufacture it in China and then sell it. So the ideal, in that sense, so there is a need to de-risk, and the ideal way to de-risk in this is, in my opinion, would be that you attract those companies to come to India and then manufacture.
Right.
Second highlight would be India's dependence on critical machine tools. Now, there are a range of critical machine tools which these came into prominence in the debate in the strategic sectors, in this strategic segment, and the section when you saw the reports about Russia-China partnership and how China is supplying critical machine tools to Russia after a trade embargo was imposed by the US and sanctions were imposed. And therefore, because they have very high utility in dual-use applications. Luckily for India, India does not import a lot of critical machine tools from China, but there are a few critical machine tools that India does import from China, and the product complexity of these machines is also high. So the recommendation would be that there is a justification for state intervention in that particular areas. And lastly, the third highlight that I would like to point out would be India's dependence on telecommunication equipment is quite high. Again, very high potential for immediate shock, and also the product complexity in this area ranges from moderate to high. So again, this is something which India needs to there needs to be a place in India's larger de-risking strategy.
Right. Now, again, all a bunch of interesting stuff. I think the key takeaway from me here was that perhaps these machines less than 10 kgs that could include laptops or tablets have low to moderate product complexity, and therefore can be substituted, albeit it might take a little more time because of the degree of dependence and the potential shock it can cause to consumers. So I guess in that sense, the government's decision to reverse that laptop import ban that was under discussion a little while ago was a good decision. And I also know, Amit, that you have some very interesting takeaways in your section on electrical goods and electronic components, but I'm going to leave that for the listeners to take away from your paper, especially considering I think it has a very vital and relatable component to it, which pertains to flat screen displays, something that we heard people throwing out of windows, especially if they found out they were made in China during the course of the pandemic. So Amit, I'm going to come to you with my last question. You've talked about some very fascinating findings that you've come to in the course of your research. What is the one key takeaway here, in your opinion, for everyone, of course, but for policymakers? This paper does a great job of kind of distilling, at least for that 65% of the import basket vis-a-vis China, where to look when it comes to discussing de-risking. So what is the one thing then you want the policymakers to take from this and then run with it?
Okay, to be very brief, I would say if you look at all the three categories individually, machineries exhibit the highest complexity among these three categories. The electronics exhibit, the machineries exhibit the highest product complexity among these categories. Electronics, despite high shock potential, exhibits the least product complexity of the three, and organic chemicals is somewhere in between. Now, with that, interesting thing that I would like the listeners to take away is that if significantly high RIF, that is the metric for immediate shock potential, is high, and which renders India vulnerable vis-a-vis China, because the substantially high shock potential. The fact that most of these items that India imports from China exhibit low to moderate product complexity, in turn renders China vulnerable in long term, in medium to long term. In the sense, there's anything that China supplies to India, none of all the things that China supplies to India, none of them exhibit high product complexity, and that means that in short to medium term, of around 80%, 90% of your supplies from China would be completely substitutable and replaceable. So while so this is a dynamic that we have to take into account, but nonetheless, it is not to say that there is not a case for de-risking yet, because China can still inflict that sort of damage through immediate shock that it can inflict upon you through cutting off supplies, and where you exhibit very high import dependence.
Right. As they say, trade is a two-way street, and
dependence also.
Dependence is two-way as well. And if economic coercion was going to lead to disruption, it would not just impact. It would of course impact Indian interests in the short term domestically, but would have substitutability with costs. But at the same time, and these are deliberations that are happening in China and about China in the world as we speak, the question of overcapacity, right? It would have implications for China as well, perhaps longer term implications as more and more alternatives come into the picture. So with that, I guess I'll say that's an optimistic note. Thank you so much, Amit, for sharing your insights with me and the listeners. I'm sure all of us had something to take away from this, and this, I believe, also acts as an excellent springboard for research on how to achieve some of these de-risking goals, which I believe is going to be the next paper in this series. But thank you so much once again, Amit, and thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy. We're going to attach the link of Amit's paper in the description, so leave your comments below. Thank you
so much.